We've heard the reports that others have heard. I don't have any details at this point in time. I hope there will be stability and peace and continuity within Turkey, but I have nothing to add with respect to what has transpired at this moment.
Zuhdi, subsequently, President Obama has said that he hopes the democratically elected government will remain in power, or words to that effect. Do you believe this coup may in fact succeed?
Well, it's hard to tell because, we keep, when you listen to what's happening, we tend to want to look at the military, JD, as one entity, when in fact, I will tell you, there's three entities in the military right now. One is the old secular guard, which was the Ataturk, sort of 80 years plus of secularism that were looked upon as the protectors of secular Turkey. The second is the Islamists that Erdogan, through his basically the Muslim Brotherhood of Turkey, the AKP, has tried to put into power, and while he weeds out the old secularists. The third is the Gulenists, which is the Hizmet movement, that is this sort of wild card, cultish, peri-Islamist movement that may be part of what's happening, in that it's sort of an intra-Islamist feud between the Gulenists, who've been getting more powerful, and the Erdogan AKP Islamist party. And it's sad to hear Kerry and President Obama sort of, the reason this is happening is they have just sort of let vacuums get filled in the Middle East. And we sort of saw the writing on the wall last week, where all of a sudden Erdogan seemed to be backing Assad, backing Russia. He seemed to have been backed into action when in fact he was probably on his way out a week ago.
Well, let's talk some about what this means geopolitically to our allies. For example, NATO has had Turkey as a member for a long time. So is this more trouble for NATO?
Well, the trouble for NATO is in the short term, if you believe the ends justify the means, then ultimately this is probably better, because you'll see probably the military was getting sick and tired of Erdogan propping up ISIS, like you appropriately mentioned, helping the Islamists, defeating any secular hope of the revolution in Syria. And ultimately this is going to help Europe see that, well, maybe now a truly anti-ISIS regime will come up in Turkey. The problem is that we in the land of freedom and liberty cannot stand behind a coup as the ends justifying the means. So just like in Egypt, as much as we wanted to see hope with El-Sisi and that he gives a pro-Western rhetoric, the methods he has been using to suppress dissent, to defeat and torture journalists and others, has not been helpful to reform. And Turkey has long been sort of immune, if you will, because it was a democracy, from the changes in the Arab awakening that happened since 2011. But now we're sort of seeing them revert back to 20th century politics, when in fact maybe they need to start evolving towards a new, because we really, in all of this, JD, nobody knows what the will of the people are. It's been silent, and the people they had a few demonstrations over the past few years in many parks, etc. But we still, because they've cut off the internet, no one really has a sense that this is really a revolution, when in fact it's something internally within the military.
There are claims that the coup has been put down, but Zuhdi, as you well know, with the fog of war, the first casualty is truth. So it's very difficult to determine what is happening here. But I am curious, because when I visited Turkey, and granted it was a decade and a half ago, really pre-9/11, so much was made of Ataturk and the fact that he, in the 20th century, founded a modern, secular Islamic republic. How many, in your opinion, how real is the feeling for what Ataturk put together in the 20th century? Is that passé, or is there a passionate sentiment to return to a secular government?
Well, this is the divide. And our entire organization, our American Islamic Forum for Democracy, has looked upon the need for a third pathway. But the two pathways in the Middle East have been this sort of secular military type protecting of the nationalist regimes versus the Islamists that look upon nationalism as minimized and actually look upon a caliphate. And the Islamists of Erdogan wanted to bring back the Ottoman Islamist victory, if you will, of pre-1920s. So at the end of the day, the experiment of secularism that lasted over 80 years in Turkey was probably the most benevolent and most moderate in the Middle East area, simply because it had that influence from Europe and was more benevolent and democratic, if you will, but it really wasn't true democracy. And they snuffed out and pushed underground the Islamist movement that I think caused them to gain strength to where they were able to take over through elections. So unless these countries like Turkey and Egypt and Syria and others can begin to develop that third pathway of true classical liberalism and liberty and democracy, where the Constitution doesn't depend on the military to protect it, but rather upon the people and the rule of law. And right now we're not seeing a rule of law. Egypt did not see a rule of law. There's no rule of law. And we're seeing this dissolution of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was what generated all of these countries in the Middle East in the early 20th century. And if that dissolves, either Erdogan's going to come up stronger and more authoritarian than he's ever been, or you're going to see a reversion back to the 20th century. And we in the West are going to have to figure out, well, we might like the ends short term, but long term, the decimation of reform voices is not in our interest if we believe in freedom and liberty.
Zuhdi, we've got about 4 minutes left. I want to get a couple of things in here on Turkey. You heard me at the outset of the program talk about Erdogan allowing ISIS to trade oil through his nation. And I'm just wondering, A, why the U.S. did not hold Erdogan accountable for that, and B, what does all this mean to Israel?
That's a great question. And this is why we are where we are, is because the president, our President Obama, and the powers that be just sort of let the Islamists take over and fill in vacuums. Not only did Turkey allow sale of oil to ISIS, until the sanctions against Iran were lifted, they were allowing Iran to buy oil through gold and other things that Turkey allowed them to subvert. So wherever you see the rise of political Islamist regimes in the Middle East, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia are the triangle that have been involved. So it really boded very poorly for Israel. And if anything, in the short term, this will be better for Israel because the secular military was more of a friend of Israel. We saw Erdogan helping Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood and other very anti-Semitic entities. But again, I would say that's a camouflage. Yes, in the short term, it might be in their benefit, but in the long term, as many in the neoconservative movement will tell you, the safest Israel can be is surrounded by democracies, not surrounded by military dictatorships that ultimately, the reason there's no Jews left in Turkey, Syria, or Iraq is because these military dictatorships are in there, and in the end, Arabist or national Turkish, and are not pro-freedom and liberty.
Got about 2.5 minutes left. Let's turn to last night's attack in Nice, France. And following that attack, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich reacted strongly, coming out very strongly against Sharia and radical Islam. Let's look and listen to Newt, then I'll ask for your reaction.
Western civilization is in a war. We should, frankly, test every person from here who is of a Muslim background, and if they believe in Sharia, they should be deported. Sharia is incompatible with Western civilization. Modern Muslims who have given up Sharia, glad to have them as citizens, perfectly happy to have them next door. But we need to be fairly relentless about defining who our enemies are.
What about that, Zuhdi?
Well, I think he has the diagnosis right, which is what I've invested my life since 9/11 in trying to repair, is that the threat of Sharia, the threat of the Islamic states, the jihadist movement can only be exposed by exposing the legal instruments, which are the supremacist Islamic State, not only ISIS, but Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc. So he's 100% right. That's the threat. But the remedy, the treatment he's giving is, I think, an abandonment of American values. Yes, we should have tests for people seeking immigration, refugees, security clearances. Yes, those tests should apply to monitoring who our Homeland Security should monitor, but we can't deport American citizens. I mean, we should.
Well, and again, let's drill down on this for a second, Zuhdi. For example, it should be absolutely acceptable to have surveillance of mosques. I mean, in terms of people coming in for services, etc., with the free exercise of worship, right?
Absolutely, and that's why we've been losing this war. Is the precursor ideologies, JD, have been completely ignored because we're countering violent extremism instead of countering violent Islamism or Shariaism and the jihadism, if you will. So he's right on that. But to say that we're going to test sitting citizens and deport them, I mean, there are many unconstitutional organizations in America, like the Nazi Party, Communist Party, that we really treat by the antiseptic of sunlight, not by making them illegal and pushing them underground.
And again, just to reiterate, you and I have talked about this before. When it comes to immigration, given the inherent problems we have, there should be a moratorium on all immigration, correct?
Absolutely. We need to shut the doors. As much as I have invested, I have family I want to get out. I would tell them stop. We have to stop all immigration until we start vetting for the ideological threat of Islamism, jihadism. And right now, all we're doing is asking the regime enemies to give us background checks.
Unfortunately, Zuhdi, we're out of time. We thank you for what you had to say. Coming back with more after this.